Name is Brad Burnham, and I'm with Union Square Ventures.
Great. Um, so let's get right to it as a private sector guy. I'd like to know how have our government institutions failed us? How are they flawed?
Small question. Uh, I think any institution is an artifact of the era in which it was created, and our institutions were created many years ago, long before we had many of the technologies that we have today, many of the forms of communication that we have today. And so I don't think they've done a great job. The government institutions have not done a great job of capitalizing on some of the technologies that we have today. So to be more specific about that, it's not just government, it's also incumbents in existing industries that haven't adapted quickly. Most governments and most incumbent industries are dominated by bureaucratic hierarchies which have existed basically for the last 150 years, and that's been the way we've organized social activity on both the public and the private sphere. We've recently begun to see the emergence of an alternative model that's based on networks. And so if you think about the way in which networks organize people, they do it in a way that's much more efficient than the current bureaucratic model. And I think the bureaucratic model on both the public and the private side is having a hard time keeping up right now.
So then, what compelled you to accept the invitation to come here, though?
Because I think there's an enormous opportunity to innovate in government, and I think it's going to become increasingly important. So I invest in a lot of networks, Twitter, Tumblr, Foursquare, Etsy, things like that. These networks connect creators directly to consumers, and they eliminate a lot of the friction that existed in the earlier bureaucratic models. The governments tend to want to regulate these networks as in the same way that they regulated the original incumbents in those markets. So think taxi and limousine service, and think about the way in which that regulator is challenged by the emergence of a network like Halo or Uber. And I think that it's not as simple as saying these are new models that must be allowed to run free. It's more complicated than that. There are some really interesting opportunities to regulate these new models, capitalizing on the unique characteristics of these new models. So, for instance, if you think again about Uber, Uber produces an enormous amount of data about what's actually happening on the street, right? They know when somebody's picked up, where they're dropped off, how long it took. They have ratings on both the passengers and the drivers, and all that information is produced as a byproduct of the service that they deliver, and it's produced for nothing, right? Think about the difference in the way that you would regulate today. You actually hire inspectors that go out on the street. They're fairly big organizations, and they have to try and catch cab drivers behaving badly. And they don't have any of the tools that Uber provides naturally as a part of its service. We need to learn to use those tools.
And how can we safeguard the effective use of those tools? I guess is the first question that comes to mind.
How can we how can we ensure that the tools are used, or that they're used effectively, or that they're...
Well, that they're used properly. I mean, with a network like that, like Uber is, right now it's just in San Francisco, is that right? Or is it all over the place?
It's in, I don't know, 10, 15 cities.
10, 15
and
cities.
then Halo, there's a number of e-hailing services. Halo's in another 4 or 5 cities.
So how can we ensure that it's being used efficiently, rather? I mean, is there ability for that to be used for, let's say someone wanted to make a certain company of drivers make them have like maybe not so good of ratings all of a sudden? Are there ways that we can implement into the network some safeguards to make it run more effectively?
That's interesting. I think that's a problem that we may one day have. It certainly isn't a problem that we have today. But that's kind of the Yelp story. I mean, how do you manage a situation where a competitor is pushing a lot of bad ratings at somebody else's restaurant? And I think what we found is that it's actually fairly easy to drown that out, and it's pretty hard to actually spoof the organic organic ratings, because it always ends up coming from one IP address, and then it's pretty easily deleted and stuff like that. So I don't think that's the problem.
Mm.
I think there are a bunch of other really interesting problems. If you use the example of Airbnb as an example, where there's a network that's creating an alternative to the existing hotel industry, right? Where somebody who has spare capacity, a bedroom, is making that available to somebody who needs a place to sleep. Well, there's implications about exposing all of the data about where that's actually happening. Now, it's one of the ways you could regulate that market, but you have to figure out to what degree that data should be personally identifiable, to what degree should it be aggregated and abstracted. There's a bunch of hard problems that need to be worked through, but the important point is that there's a resource there that could allow that market to be managed in a socially responsible way much more efficiently.
What are some of the insights that you've heard that have really grabbed you today?
I've been involved in the group that's been trying to think about how to frame questions, and we're particularly working on a problem of public participation in decision making, really, in political decision making. And the most interesting aspect of that conversation that I was a part of was trying to think through ways to create that engagement that didn't become dumbed down, and yet managed to organize the questions in a way that were accessible to a larger audience. Because what happens in almost any situation, we were talking earlier about water, and particularly in Canada, but there's a whole bunch of very technical questions about the degree to which water moves through aquifers, the degree to which certain species are dependent on certain cycles, and things like that ordinary citizens couldn't be expected to understand. People who have a vested interest in water policy tend to invest in the scientific investigation and the scientists, frankly, to be able to debate those points. But how do you manage that if you want the wisdom of the crowds, the wisdom of the ordinary citizen to weigh in? You have to somehow take that complexity and reduce it to something that's a set of principles. And we were talking about various different ways to do that were, I think, pretty interesting.
You've been in the private sector for quite a while now. So what in the first 20 years of the private sector, especially the internet revolution, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from those first 20 years, especially since the internet revolution, that we can apply to our public institutions?
Well, there's obviously, I'm a fan, right? I believe in the internet. I believe in the fundamental transformative ability of the internet, and I think it's a really important thing for us as a society to embrace. But at the same time, if you wanted a lesson, we tend to do things in sort of boom or bust cycles in the private sector. We got very, very enthusiastic without a lot of underlying infrastructure in the late 90s, and when it became clear that there was nothing holding up that enthusiasm, that was a problem. We had a crash. And I think that I think it's probably also true as we think about applying the internet to the public sector that we can become really enthusiastic. We can overinvest and have problems associated with that, and then we can have disillusionment. I think the important lesson is, if we again go back to the private sector, what came out of that crash was a much more sustainable commitment to the real capabilities of the internet. And I think what we have to be a little bit careful of is not getting ahead of ourselves, and yet at the same time being conscious of the possibility that we will get ahead of ourselves, and that we can't lose sight of the long-term goal just because we have, as an example, a use of this network data that causes harm to an individual inadvertently, and then results in a in a crash in terms of the use of that kind of capacity, and takes a long time to build that back. But I think if we keep our eye on the ball long term, what we'll do is we'll realize that these are really hard problems. They're really interesting problems. It's great to have really smart people engaging in these problems because we're talking about designing the very structure of our society going forward, and this is going to be the medium through which our society is defined going forward. So it's worth the investment.
So it sounds like it's like let's get on the same page first, and then realize we're still going to have problems, but we still need to get on that level playing field. We have to move forward at least at some.
We have to move forward. I would rather move forward than get on the same page, because I think what's better is to experiment with lots of different ways, but run a lot of small experiments, none of which could be catastrophic on its own, but learn from those experiments rather than trying to define a perfect solution, which would take a long, protracted political process. It's like trying to define a standard in the tech world. It's just really hard. But if something emerges organically, or lots of different things emerge organically, what generally happens is one of those things grows to a point where it becomes a de facto standard. I think that's a better approach.
I used to work with Beth when I was in law school. I was her intern when she was at the White House and stuff. And one of the things that I always was asking her about, and it's kind of appropriate now, is why can't we use some of these tools that I'm using already, like the Facebooks and the Twitters and stuff like that? And there was a little bit of that, when there was like some crisis management stuff. I know Twitter was used quite frequently. But how can some of these private companies start using some of their tools and their networks for public good? I know there's always that, privacy issues and the security issues that happen along there. Is there a way to bridge that gap?
Well, I think we have to do the heavy lifting of working through those issues, and I don't think they're simple issues. But I'll give you one that I'm always amused by. You walk around the streets of New York and you look at policemen and women on the streets of New York. I would say more than half the time they're looking at a smartphone than dealing with their radio, right? I mean, at least maybe it's because I'm seeing them in their downtime and not, but in any case, they're always looking at the smartphone. I read recently that they've just introduced an app that they've made available to police smartphones that actually exposes all the building department data to the smartphone, so they know exactly who's in the building. All the public housing authority data is now on these apps, right? Well, you could have built that as a government contract, and we would have spent 30, 40, 50 million dollars, to have some systems integrator build that thing and build a special device, and it wouldn't have been integrated in anything else. Or you allow these consumer technologies to infiltrate. Now, another area where we worry a lot about public safety is in the area of spectrum. We want to set aside spectrum for those police radios. Well, it turns out that the police are using the damn cell phone network. Maybe we should be thinking that as we look at it, the cell phone network is actually more robust than the police radio network, and we shouldn't be trying to separate out that spectrum. We should be trying to use the spectrum more efficiently and making sure that the police have some kind of privileged access to the cell network, so at certain times. But I think that's there's just a ton of opportunities to take consumer technologies and make them available to law enforcement, to public services. It turns out that the hard part is not the technology. I think we're already there. In the old days, we used to think about technology trickling down from NASA. Tang, I think was, and it came down, and NASA, military, ultimately civilians. Right now, what's happening is it's going civilians, military, ultimately NASA. Right, and so. There's a reason for that. I mean, there's just a much bigger market among civilians, and we now have the base level of technology that's available. The tools, the open source software that allow people to create these services very quickly, and there's just a ton of decentralized energy creating lots of really interesting services. So the consumer market is now moving really quickly, whereas the government market is still constrained by sort of purchasing contract law and all sorts of other issues that make it difficult to get that technology to to government services. I think we got to break that down. I think we got to recognize that it's moving faster on the private sector side, for these consumer-facing services, and we got to think about more ways of embracing those services. But the problem isn't technology. The problem is when you introduce these services, what are the implications? What are the implications in terms of privacy? What are the implications in terms of security of those networks? Consumer safety. There's a whole bunch of problems that we have to think through, but they're all, unfortunately, they're not simple technical problems in which I just got to make this chip go 10 times faster. That's a fairly constrained problem. They're moral problems. What's the right balance between an individual's right to privacy and a government's right to know? Those are not simple questions.
And those become political questions too at a certain point, which always makes everything much more difficult.
Right.
So my last question is, so this is just an experiment here today. We can call this experiment 1 here at the summit.
Yep.
What would you think experiment 2 should look like if we were all to gather again? And what are the types of questions or what are the types of outputs that you would like to see in the next time we would do something like this?
Well, I don't know. I think it probably depends a little bit on the audience that you gather. I feel if I had a criticism of where we were today, there was a lot of conversation, at least in my group, that was very thoughtful but very abstract, and I couldn't wrestle it down to the ground to understand immediately what to do with it. One of the great things about working in the private sector where I work is there's this concept of a hackathon where people actually spend 24 hours and come out with something that they can show. There's something great about that. And if there were a way to introduce it, I know there's some of that working its way through here, but I'm not close enough to understand exactly how that's happening. But I would say figuring out a way to deliver something more tangible, and one way one could think about that, for instance, obviously governments have been experimenting with opening up APIs and opening up government data and letting people hack on that data and come up with applications, and there have been some neat examples of things that have been done, but maybe incorporating something like that so that there was a sense of more tangible output would be fun.
I would tend to agree with that.
All right.